Hello, and welcome back to the shop. On today's episode, we're going to do a little electrical repair and replace the connectors on this RC car battery with some newer, higher amperage ones. We're going to be using a solder gun and a couple other tools that you see positioned there on the table. Should be a short little fun project, and I'll show you how to solder these new connectors on. This is the old style Tamiya connector, and they're a very good connector. They're a nice safe one, but they're not very good at handling high amperage. So we're going to get rid of this Tamiya connector off of this battery here, and since this is a fairly high milliamp hour battery, we're going to need to replace the connectors because the draw of the motor is going to suck the electricity through this connector very quickly. So these are a connector called Dean's connectors, and they're a very common connector. They're a really good connector because they handle high amperage well, and they're a very small connector. So it's a great connector to choose for high amperage, and that's what we're going to be putting on today. So there's two sides of them. There's a male side and a female side, and whenever we are going to change the connector on the battery, we want to make sure that we put the end that is dead onto the battery. So when we connect the wires up over here, these two little connectors will attach to the battery wires, and then this side over here has no physical connection, so it's hard to get shocked. Whereas if I put the male side on, if I touched any little piece of metal across here, it would short out. So whenever you're attaching these to the battery, you want to make sure you put the correct side on. And we're going to put this female side on the battery so there's no probes sticking out to shock anyone. Step number one is going to be to cut the old connector off. So I'll just go ahead and snip this thing off. I want to do is cut an appropriate amount of heat shrink tubing and get that ready to go. So I'll just kind of put this in place here and see how much heat shrink tubing that I need, and I'll cut off just a little bit extra what I think I need. I'll need one for the positive side, the red, and one for the black. Once the heat shrink pieces are cut, go ahead and slide those on the wire now because it's very easy to forget them, and you'll solder the whole thing back together and realize you forgot to put the heat shrink on and have to redo your whole job all over again. So go ahead and slide those on and push them all the way to the back of the wire. That way there's no heat that gets to them and shrinks them in the wrong spot. So that's a mistake I've made several times in my life, and I don't want to do it today. Once you've got the wires cut, we're going to strip one of these wires at a time, and this is 16 gauge wire, so I'll go ahead and strip off an appropriate amount. And it'll leave you with a little frayed end like that. Just swirl it all together, make sure the wires are all nice and tight. I'm only going to strip off the end of one of these wires right now because I would not want the two wires to touch and short out. So I'll leave the other side alone so that it keeps all the insulation on it, and I'll do that one second. I'm going to start with the red wire, which in a direct current system is always going to be the positive. So we'll use the red to do it first. I'm not sure if it'll show up on the camera or not, but I want to identify which of these two prongs is the plus and which one is the minus. And this one here that's sideways is going to be the plus, and so that's the one I'm going to start with. These connectors consist of two parts. There's a metal part and then this like hard plastic. It's always a good idea if you push the connectors together. That way it'll dissipate some of the extra heat and it will hold the connectors in the correct position. Sometimes when these metal parts get really hot from the soldering, they'll make the plastic soft, and then they'll shift positions a little bit, and so when you go to push them back together, they won't fit correctly. So it's a good idea when you solder, just a good habit to get into is to push them together. Okay, so I'm going to push these together and then clamp them into place. I'm going to use a little pair of needle nose pliers, and then I'll wrap a rubber band around the end to clamp it all into place. Whenever you solder, you always need to have at least 1 or 2 extra hands, so anything you can do to make your life a little easier is a smart thing to do. So now I'm kind of set up to solder everything. I'll go ahead and get the solder station set up and running. This would be a good time to mention what kind of soldering iron you want to use. You want to use one that's got a flat tip on it so that it can put a lot of heat into the joint quickly, and you want to make sure that you use a solder gun that's powerful enough for this job. I would recommend at least 80 watts minimum, but truthfully I think it's better if you have more power for this job. So at least 100 watt soldering iron would be best. I'm going to use this butane one. These butane torches are fantastic. They're super portable and they deliver a ton of heat quickly. Having trouble soldering these Dean's connectors, it's very likely because you have a weak soldering gun. These need to deliver a lot of heat into the joint quickly to melt the solder without passing too much heat down along the wire. If you're having a hard time and your solder is not melting instantly, you're going to have a hell of a time soldering these Dean's connectors. So it's probably your soldering iron. You'll see mine, it'll melt almost instantly, and that's what you want when doing these. I'm going to get my soldering iron warmed up. And I'm just going to let it sit on the side and warm up for a little bit here. I've been letting the soldering iron heat up for, I don't know, 20-30 seconds, so it should be hot enough. I'm going to go ahead and clean the tip off. And then I want to pre-tin the soldering iron with a little bit of solder. And so on the underside of it, I'm just going to put a tiny blob of solder. What that'll do is it'll conform perfectly to any imperfections in the soldering iron, so it delivers a lot of heat. The next step is I've got a little blob of solder on the end of the soldering iron. I'm going to tin the wire. So I'm going to put the soldering iron on the wire and just let it heat up for a second. After just a couple seconds of doing this, it should be hot enough to melt the wire. And what I'd prefer is that the wire got hot enough to suck in the solder on its own without just hitting the soldering iron. And I want to cover the wire completely with solder. So it's a little more solder than what I'd use if I was repairing a wire. I want to add so much solder that there's kind of a little blob of solder right on the end of the wire. Now that the wire has been tinned, I'm going to prep the connector with a little solder as well. And again, I'm going to put a little blob on here. So again, I'm going to touch the soldering iron, get a little blob on it. That will conduct heat very well when I put the soldering iron to the connector. I'm going to touch the soldering iron to the connector, let it get hot, and then I'm going to touch it with the solder and make a little blob of solder on top of the connector here. So now I have the wire completely filled with solder, and I have the connector have a blob of solder on it. So now what I need to do is melt these two things together so that they'll sit perfectly flush with each other. Now my solder iron gets very hot very quickly, so this shouldn't get very hot for my fingers, but you could hold this with a pair of pliers if you needed to as well. So again, same thing as before. I'm going to get a little blob of solder on my soldering iron just to deliver the heat efficiently. And then I'm going to do two things. I'm going to touch the solder on the connector to get it molten, and then I'm going to touch the soldering on the wire to get it molten. Then I'm going to push it down into the other solder, and it should get molten and pass the solder around. Now I'm just going to hold it there for a second, and once it cools down, it'll be stuck in place. Once the red wire is done, we're going to move our attention to the black, and same thing again, we're going to strip off a little bit of wire. Okay, the insulation is gone, so same thing, curl up the wire, double check our heat shrink is on it, good, and in this time we're going to move this connector over to the side and clamp it down into position. Okay, the process will just repeat itself now. I'll go ahead and clean off the soldering iron a little. Put a dab of solder on the gun. Put the soldering iron to the wire. It's going to start passing the heat in there, and then I'll melt some solder into the wire. And again, remember, I'm going to put a little extra in there because I want it to be a little bit of a blob so that it will easily pass onto the connector. Now we'll get the connector ready to go. Again, clean the soldering iron, put a little blob on it. Now it should go nice and quick like this. If it doesn't, remember your soldering gun's not powerful enough for these connectors. It goes really easy if you have a good gun, and that's what you want to see. So mine just went on there in a quick split second, and now it's just cooling off so that I can add the heat shrink tubing. Okay, and the last step before I've got this thing completed is to go ahead and put the heat shrink tubing on. So I'll slide one down and hit it with the torch. And the torch will shrink it into position nicely. I'll go ahead and slide the red on. Hit it with the torch, and it will shrink it into position. And now I can just go around the edges and just shrink it in all the tight spots I couldn't get to before. And there you have it, a completed soldering job. Now that it's all done, I could pull the other side off, and I've got my finished connector.